pulling the stuff back up so we can get back to that video, because he seems like he's doing okay right now. Oh, what just happened? I was in a void. I hate when that happens. You know, when you click on the wrong thing and then you go somewhere else? Yeah, that's what just happened. All right, so here we're gonna have our last video of the day, which is how people in the Roaring Twenties spent their free time by Weird History. There's so many places you can go with this, like jazz is becoming popular. We got flapper girls roaming the earth. There's so much interesting stuff about the 20s, but mostly jazz and flapper girls. And Prohibition, which is also interesting, but everybody manages to drink, so that's also interesting. So let's get started with this. I want to see what angle they go at this, because there's a million different ways they can
Your
get
high
this.
school history textbook probably spent more time talking about America's recovery from World War I during the 1920s than anything else. But life during the Roaring Twenties was about much more than that. Throughout the decade, the country's economy doubled.
And that's just how people stood back then. It was customary at the time. I think I learned more about the Roaring Twenties than the country's recovery. It feels like we always skip right into like Roaring Twenties, cultural revolution stuff, more than the like financial woes of the states.
Had more free time, and it became known as an era of prosperity. Of course, all of that screeched to a halt when Wall Street crashed in 1929, leading to the Great Depression. Today, we're taking a break to look back at how people during the Roaring Twenties spent their free time. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. Oh, and if that's just not enough, leave a comment and let us know what topics you would like to hear about. Okay, we're about to party like it's 1929. Woo!
Cool.
January.
So you're about to party like you're like imminently about to be ruined. You know, I feel that. I can relate.
17th, 1920 was a dark day for American drinkers. That was the day the 18th Amendment went into effect, banning the sale, transportation, and consumption of alcohol in the United States. For the next 13 years, Prohibition sent the entire process underground. Plenty of bootlegging operations and speakeasies popped up almost overnight to bring the sweet, sweet alcohol to the people. Sure.
This is where the United States, one would think they would learn that Prohibition doesn't really work all that well, because this empowered like the mafia. This is like Al Capone is like stepping into the limelight and stuff, and just by making stuff illegal, you push it underground, and then people who are willing to take advantage of that are going to not conduct that business as safely as perhaps a well-regulated system that's out in the open would. Like if you decide you wanted to regulate alcohol but keep it legal, it's far safer than just letting the people who are like not going to be very nice about the whole thing, might be willing to kill folks over such things, just do whatever they want because they're already doing illegal stuff. And it doesn't mean that don't make anything illegal, but there are some things when it comes to like drugs and alcohol. It's probably better to regulate it than let the black market decide.
You couldn't exactly walk into one of these establishments. These operations could be as small as a bathtub moonshine affair, or as big as an international bootlegging ring. Despite its illegality, alcohol was pretty easy to find and imbibe. The infamous gangster...
It's a lot like weed. It's very easy to find. It's been easy to find despite the fact that it's illegal. And marijuana is still illegal federally in the United States. So the federal government can crack down on it whenever they decide to, even in the places where it's legal on the state level. Federal law trumps state law. So if the feds decide to come into a place where marijuana is legal at the state level, they can do that. It's because federal law trumps state law. So that's what that is. So we're kind of in a precarious situation around the prohibition of marijuana until it's legal at the federal level. It's still, in a sense, illegal everywhere, even though we're kind of just, people are just being allowed to do whatever with it. It just takes one person who's really against it getting in office and deciding to take some action.
Al Capone was heavily involved in the illegal trade, too, making over $60 million per year during Prohibition. He was eventually imprisoned for tax evasion in 1931, but not before becoming the most infamous gangster of the period. Al Capone's favorite activity also led to an increase in gang violence related to
Snorky.
Culminating in the 1929 St. Valentine's Day Massacre, when Capone's henchmen...
St. Valentine's Day Massacre, it's like the Treaty of Versailles. There's like 20 of them. You look up St. Valentine's Day Massacre and they'll just be like, what year? And they'll give you a list of like 20 different years.
Masqueraded as police officers and brutally gunned down several members of a rival gang. Enterprising folks looking for whiskey or beer lurked through the shadows to find the speakeasies. These illegal bars, which often had live music, were only accessible through passwords and secret entrances. They were also frequently raided by the feds. But the owners knew how to avoid serious consequences, so it wouldn't be long before your favorite watering hole was open for business once again. Of course, there were always other things to do that didn't involve drinking. If drinking illegally wasn't your thing, you could always sit on a flagpole. Way back in the halcyon days of 1924, a guy named Aloysius Anthony Kelly started the trend of flagpole sitting. The idea came to him when he managed to stay on top of a narrow beam for more than 13 hours after a friend dared him to do it. Things were pretty boring in those days, apparently. After
that's like a meme, or like a TikTok trend or something, just manifesting in just a different time, I guess. And there's pictures of him. This is like when planking was a thing. That might be going back a little bit.
Successfully completing the dare, Kelly realized he had a special talent for this sort of thing. Nicknamed Shipwreck Kelly for his claim that he survived the sinking of the Titanic, Kelly ended up spending 22 days on top of a pole in New York's Madison Square Garden. But that's not all, folks. Shipwreck Kelly outdid himself in Baltimore by sitting atop a 60-foot pole for more than 45 days. Kelly's favorite pastime swept the nation, and people from all over the world tried to approach or surpass his record. But flagpole sitting wasn't the only popular athletic activity to rise in popularity during the 1920s. If
driving
movies
around
weren't your thing, you could always just go for a drive. Advances in car manufacturing made vehicles safer, more comfortable, and more affordable. It goes without saying, although we'll say it, that automobile sales soared during the 1920s. In 1921, the Federal Highway Act led to new road construction, making it easier for folks to get around. That's when leisurely driving became a popular pastime.
This is Ford's America. Really, a lot of the time when we define eras in American history, a lot of people define it by the people who are in government, but often it's even better to define it based on those who are financially powerful, because they're often ones who really drive the things that the culture latches onto. And I'd consider this the era of Ford.
Camping to cruising, going on a road trip and exploring the town became fashionable for millions. They weren't exactly getting fast and furious, but the automobile's popularity in the 1920s cleared the way for modern car culture to eventually become a reality at a later time. Seems like everyone takes time out of their Sunday afternoon to watch the game these days, but live sports didn't really come into style until the 1920s. Known as the golden era of sports, Americans found a delightful escape in sports like baseball.
That's Babe Ruth, right?
Golden era.
I don't know
sports,
stuff that well.
Americans found.
I think that's a slightly young Babe Ruth. I'm not sure. It kind of looks like his face. I'm not, like I said, I'm not great with sports, but there we go.
Found a delightful escape in sports like baseball and
All right,
boxing.
Neron, we'll see you next time. All right. I'll try to be back next week.
But largely thanks to Babe Ruth, the game
skyrocketed
in popularity. Ushering in the era of the home run, Ruth led the league with 29 home runs in his first season as a hitter. But another sport also caught public imagination. Boxing. Much like today, 1920s sports fans also enjoyed watching two people punch each other in the face. Boxing offered a glamorous, exciting spectacle for spectators and gamblers alike.
There's a whole genre of history based around sports history, but also if you're getting into things like cultural history and you really want to understand ordinary people during a time where their voices aren't heard nearly as much as like the rich and powerful and the politically active, a good place to go when gauging people's values during any particular time is what sports are they watching, or like who are their heroes, what TV shows are they watching. It's kind of a scope into people's lives. It's really interesting how much you can learn based on what people are watching.
And if you couldn't make it to a game, the radio or newspaper recaps had you covered. Speaking of the radio, we may take it for granted, at least for those who still listen to it, but radio wasn't always common in American homes. By the end of 1929, however, 10 million American homes were using them to connect with the outside world. While they were great for news, radio also brought sports, art, and entertainment to the masses. Much like streaming and the internet make up our entertainment options today, radio served the same purpose back then. That is, until
I'm doing that thing.
television came along. Radio also opened up the opportunity for advertisers and marketing firms to pitch their products to larger audiences worldwide. Some things never change. But radio wasn't the only popular entertainment source at the time. Everyone loves movies. In the 1920s,
movies are going from being like... Movies are so interesting. They started as just like filming ordinary, mundane things. I think movies really started hitting their stride in the 20s, in my opinion, or the maybe in the 10s. But like I think we started hitting some really good ones in the 1920s. People are starting to really figure out the tricks around film, and it's all being built from the ground up at this point.
Checking out the latest flick at the cinema was an event. Cinema became an exciting, captivating form of entertainment that would later become a cultural juggernaut in America. But in the 1920s, it was still a nascent art form and finding its way. The folks who attended those early films were among the first generation to become enamored with the silver screen. Eventually, Hollywood began releasing upward of 700 films a year, influencing culture in a major way. Popular films influenced and inspired fashion trends, merchandise, and household items. Advertising firms saw great promise in cinema and invested significantly in product placement and trailers. Although they play in front of a feature today, movie trailers themselves were advertisements for upcoming films that trailed features. Get it? Trailer.
Nosferatu, yes! Oh my god. That's a fun one. I didn't realize that was during this time. Like, the chronology is all messed up in my head, but that's wonderful. I saw that image and I got excited.
But if there wasn't a good film out, you had plenty of other options. Joining cinema and radio as popular pastimes in the 1920s was the idea of keeping up with the news. Reading Time magazine was a pretty big deal at the time. Thanks to the weekly publication of Time magazine, anyone could keep up with the news of the world. From its inaugural March 3, 1923 issue onward, Time was a hit. Time magazine founders Britton Haddon and Henry Luce desired to make an accessible, engaging publication to keep readers updated on current events. Better yet, Time was designed to only take about an hour to read. Loaded with first-hand accounts and strong narratives, the magazine kept a reader's attention and became a constant presence on the periodical rack for decades to come. The magazine sold well throughout the decades and still holds the status of being one of the most well-known and circulated periodicals today. Speaking of Time,
dance crazes,
most people love to cut a rug every once in a while. human endurance activities were all the rage in the 1920s. Having a dance marathon was a logical conclusion. Much like today's enduring reality TV dance contests, couples entered these competitions to win cash and other prizes. Of course, these dance contests lasted weeks or months, generating considerable controversy. Many cities ended up banning them as disruptive, disturbing, and even repugnant. As the Great Depression loomed...
Whenever people are having fun, there's usually a class of people that are going to, like, talk about how this is, like, the downfall of this culture or whatever, this new craze. It's ruining our moral values, etc., etc.
People entered the contest for fun and survival as the economy began to take a nosedive. Jazz-inspired dance marathons might have offered some reprieve from what was to come, but they had nothing on jazz music itself. Jazz helped create more lively songs and rhythms, ushering in a time of more danceable music, and people loved it. The upbeat, celebratory nature of jazz inspired another nickname for the Roaring '20s, the Jazz Age. Jazz legends like Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and Jelly Roll Morton rose to fame in the 1920s, setting the legendary soundtrack for the era. Jazz found its ways to clubs all over the country. Young people flocked to wherever it was played and tried out new dances like the Charleston. The genre was also largely responsible for creating the flapper movement, characterized
like predominantly black music has this pattern that you can really see starting with jazz. It starts as this like underground thing in these segregated communities where these people are really enjoying and developing their own culture among this broader American culture. And they're not being bothered all that much because often they are performing this music among their own people, and a lot of the time it doesn't really become an issue, but then it starts to branch out a little bit. It becomes controversial, and then it gets accepted a little bit, and then suddenly white people are playing it. It happened with jazz, happens with a lot of rock music, rap music. Like we're seeing it now. Like rap music started as like this really controversial thing, and I don't think rap music is all that controversial anymore. I think it's been sanitized. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if we're in for a new music, if we're like overdue for a new musical revolution, like a new genre to come in and take over. And you know what? We're in the 20s again. It's about time. We gotta see what's gonna happen.
By short hair, flashy gowns, and red lipstick, flappers were the fashionistas of their day. In an ugly article published in 1920, the Atlantic Monthly defined flappers as women who trot like foxes, limp like lame ducks, one step like cripples, and all to the barbaric yawp of strange instruments which transform the whole scene into a moving picture of a fancy ball in Bedlam. The Atlantic Monthly's description did nothing to stop the movement. The flapper style was pretty popular until the Great Depression put an end to that too. But flapper culture inspired something unexpected among the youth.
It's loved.
Decades before George Carlin was on stage talking about words and wordplay, the youth of the 1920s engaged in wordplay and slang as a hobby. Yeah, riveting. Inspired by the free-form nature of jazz and flapper culture, kids went wild and crazy with the wordplay. Are you a blue nose or someone who puts a damper on the mood or festivities? Do you like sinkers, also known as donuts? Do you know your onions when it comes to 1920 slang? Have you...
This is when youth culture is really emerging as kind of a unique thing. Youth culture, like, the youth has always been a little bit disconnected from the generation before it, and you know that just kind of happens. Time passes, people change from generation to generation. But I think when you start getting into the 1900s, you'll see that youth culture has taken on a completely different meaning. So it's not surprising to see things like slang becoming more popular.
Ever heard of a sockdolager? Someone or something which is truly remarkable or impressive. Noodle juice. Tea being zozzled. very drunk, or drinking some foot juice, cheap subpar wine. If you haven't, don't worry. You're not alone. Some of the crazy linguistic turns live in our collective memory today, even if no one actually uses them.
Ouija boards.
When they weren't having fun.
Ouija boards, because like of the spiritualism movement. We've talked about this in, I think that was in the second live stream we did.
Fun with words, kids like to play board games at parties. It all started with the popular tile game Mahjong. In 1922, Joseph B. Babcock imported the game and began selling simplified versions of it to the masses. A 4-player game with unique iconography and imagery requires skill and strategy to win. It was definitely an international hit, spawning countless imitators over the years. But Mahjong wasn't the only party game being played at the time. Kids in the Roaring 20s loved their Ouija boards. Essentially a parlor game, the first Ouija boards appeared around 1890. In 1901, game manufacturer William Fuld began producing them, seeing an increase in sales and popularity that grew with the rising public interest in the occult and spiritualism. People took the Ouija board to task for myriad questions or to speak with departed loved ones, hoping to gain some insight from the spirit world. It grew in popularity from there, but an aura of myth.
Yeah, we talked about how in the episode where I talked a whole lot about Houdini and his battle against spiritualists, and we talked a little bit about Arthur Conan Doyle, the guy who wrote the Sherlock Holmes books, and how he was like a big spiritualist. But it was a big thing after a world war. People are popping in, and people are like popping in. What was I saying there? Sorry, I read something on my table while I was thinking, and I involuntarily said something. And people are mourning the loss of their loved ones, and there's kind of international grief and stuff. So, naturally, communicating with the dead might be appealing.
Mystery surrounds the device. Fuld himself used the board to guide his business decisions and built a factory based on guidance from the board. In 1927, he died in a freak accident falling from the roof of that very same factory. And if you think that's spooky, it's got nothing on some of the weird stuff students were doing on college campuses. Fashion trends come and go, but sometimes they take a bizarre turn along the way. One of the biggest trends on Ivy League campuses in the 1920s was acquiring raccoon fur coats. But they didn't stop at acquisition. Oh, no. The students would make a point to flaunt their new raccoon furs all over the place. While they were busy revealing their inner Davy Crockett for the world to see, the fur coats eventually caught national attention. One guy, George Olson, even wrote a song about them in 1928 called "Doin' the Raccoon." The song was later covered by Rudy Valley and can easily be found online if you're keen to listen. But with lyrics like,
well, that's there.
They wear them down in Princeton, and they share them up at Yale, and they eat them at Harvard, but they sleep in them in jail. You can just take our word for it.
That's
so
wonderful.
What do you think?
That's really weird. What's up with you? What's got you mad? That is such a fascinating video. There's always more to get into with the 1920s, but I learned a couple ones there. There's a couple that I didn't know about there. There's always some of the basic stuff when you get into jazz music and youth culture and stuff. You'll learn a lot of the same stuff, but a couple of those very unique things to cover, and I appreciate those choices.